Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Sadia Nahar, research analyst at Osmani Centre. I welcome you all to another episode of Osmani Talks. Today we are joined by Derek Grossman, Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. Today we are going to talk about how the global geopolitics is shifting and what a more transactional multipolar world means for South Asia, especially Bangladesh. Thank you, Professor, for joining us today.
It's great to be here with you.
Thank you. Professor, we are witnessing shifting alignment dynamics amid the ongoing wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. At the same time, there appears to be a broader recalibration of U.S. strategic priorities. For example, the renaming of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command to Pacific Command or the postponement of the Quad Summit. We have also seen President Trump's May 2026 visit to China and focus on strategic stability, which China puts it as constructive relationship of strategic stability. So my question is, Professor, what do you think? Do these developments suggest that Washington is gradually moving away from its earlier pivot to Asia strategy and placing greater strategic emphasis on the Northern Hemisphere? And if so, what implications could such a shift have for the strategic significance of the Indo-Pacific region and more particularly the Indian Ocean region?
Okay. So I think I would have to go back to the first Trump administration when we first renamed the Asia Pacific to the Indo-Pacific region, and we began in earnest to try to counter and contain China. And yes, I use the word contain very purposefully and specifically. It's not something that you would hear out of any administration's mouth, but that is de facto what we were trying to do vis-a-vis China. Yeah. The national security strategy, the national defense strategy, and the Indo-Pacific strategy at the time during the first Trump administration all talked about the need to work in concert with U.S. allies and partners, not just throughout the region, but throughout the world to counter China. And I put in contain China because ultimately that was the objective in an unstated way. The Biden administration, as many disagreements as it had with the Trump administration, it actually maintained that general approach.
Yes.
But what's interesting is when you get to this second Trump administration, things have changed quite dramatically to the point of your question. And I think you can chalk this up to the fact that Trump has people around him nowadays who are not the same people as before. In his first administration, he essentially had people who would occasionally question his policies and hopefully, from their perspective, get him to change the policies, right? So that they could conform to more traditional U.S. foreign policy and strategy. However, in the second Trump administration, he doesn't have anyone around him to constrain him any longer. Instead, he has loyalists around him. These are people who essentially will implement whatever he says without question. And what we have seen is that Trump, the person, believes very differently about China and the Indo-Pacific than, say, his first administration or maybe his second administration as well. Trump, the president, believes that we should have a G2. We should have a power-sharing relationship with China. He fashions himself, Trump does, as being a fellow strongman alongside Xi Jinping. And that is where you get this whole spheres of influence approach.
Yes.
Another name for spheres of influence is essentially empire building, that we do what we want in the Western Hemisphere. And that also means that China can do what it wants in East Asia, and Russia can do what it wants in Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe. And yes, for your region, unfortunately for Bangladesh and for you, that India would, or that Trump's plan originally was, I think, to have India play the predominant role within South Asia. That has changed now because of a whole bunch of different reasons. Trump and Modi had a big falling out last summer.
Yes.
So I think he's begged off of that position with India. But that has also now meant that India is not as important within the Indo-Pacific strategy and within the Indo-Pacific construct. To the point of your question, you mentioned how the U.S. reverted Indo-PACOM back to PACOM, right? On paper, you could say, well, it's the same area of responsibility, includes the same countries, so what? but it actually is more than just the area of responsibility on paper. The concept of the Indo-Pacific is really an organizing concept for containing and countering China, especially on its western flank, and not just leveraging India to do that, but the entire Indian Ocean region to include the islands and littoral states, including Bangladesh, to kind of enlist their support to cause more problems for China on its west, so that in the event of a Taiwan scenario or a South China Sea conflict or a Korea scenario, China would have to pick and choose east versus western flanks what to deal with. Okay, that is no longer the geostrategy that is in play in the United States. I think that, if you listen to the Trump administration officials,
Yes.
so whether it's Secretary of State Marco Rubio or Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth or any of these folks, they will make it seem like we are still engaging with our allies and partners just the same as we did during Biden and the first Trump administrations. The only difference is we're asking them to spend a bit more on defense, right? That we're asking them to step up more than they did in the past. But see, here's the thing. If you listen to Undersecretary of Defense Bridge Colby's speech in the Philippines yesterday, he didn't mention China at all and is asking the allies and partners to step up for a threat that he's afraid to even mention, because Trump has obviously put out the directive that nobody will talk about China in an unflattering way so long as I want to maintain a good relationship with Xi. So we are now seeing, I think, this G2 formulate. And I'll also just very briefly point you to the fact that in the past, the Pentagon has met with the Chinese, with their counterparts, and they talk about power sharing in the region. They talk about Asia-Pacific, not Indo-Pacific. Go look at Secretary Pete Hegseth's speech at the annual Shangri-La Dialogue earlier this year in Singapore. No mention of Indo-Pacific, only Asia-Pacific. Why? Because we are now dialing it back. We are sort of resetting our relationship with China. It's not to say that there aren't some real friction still there. There are. They exist. They're kind of structural. But if Trump had it his way, those wouldn't exist and we could just have a good relationship with China. And so far, he's able to kind of, because he's president, commander-in-chief, he's able to kind of reposition our approach just enough so that it is a, I think, pro-engagement approach now as opposed to a pro-deterrence approach.
So what I've understood is there is a very much stark contrast between Trump's first administration and Trump 2.0.
Absolutely.
And there is also a kind of diplomatic signaling in terms of reverting back to Pacific Command. So building on your answer, Professor, now I want to focus on the emerging global order of transactional multipolarity. The United States appears to be moving toward a more pragmatic approach, I would say, towards flexible realism, as we have seen in the 2025 US National Security Strategy. So as major power competition intensifies and the rules-based international order becomes increasingly contested, smaller states face growing pressure to protect their sovereignty while also safeguarding their economic and security interests. So my question is, in this evolving geopolitical environment, how should smaller South Asian countries like Bangladesh navigate so that they can maintain their sovereignty, also they don't become too much over-dependent on any single power?
Yeah. So, well, first, let me just say a word about flexible realism. This is something the administration talks about. I'm not sure I know what that is. I don't know that really anybody knows what that is because it's not a real term. They made it up. Okay, in realism, what you do is you ensure that you maintain as much power as possible vis-a-vis your rival. And the United States right now is shedding that ability to maintain a monopoly over power because we're alienating our allies and partners by doing things like reciprocal tariffs, by threatening them publicly.
Yes.
That doesn't bode well for a realist strategy. And China can now have more inroads into some of these countries that would have normally been involved in helping us to counter and contain China. So we are, I think, straying pretty far from realism. But, I am a realist. Okay, so I will then now turn to the second part, which is, how should the smaller countries be dealing with this? Well, the same concept applies, which is if you're Bangladesh, you want to try to have good relations with as many countries as possible in order to be able to collectively deal with potential threats. All right, so if that threat happens to be India, I'm not putting words in your mouth, but if it is, right, you want to have a better relationship with China, you want to have a better relationship with the United States. If the threat happens to be the United States, because of tariffs, because of other things we may be doing in the future, then yeah, you may want to have a better relationship with India and China. So there's kind of this play off each other that needs to happen. And I think your country, from what I've been informed over the last day plus now that I've been here in Dhaka, your country is trying to do that. Now, it's not easy because obviously there are different advantages in dealing with different countries at different times. You know, you'd like to have a better relationship with India. Of course, there's the Sheikh, but of course there's the Sheikh Hasina issue. She has not been returned yet, right? So this is going to be like circumstantial, you know, depends on what's happening in the moment. But I also heard something interesting yesterday about the need to have a reversible policy in Bangladesh. Like, so, you know, if you're having a stronger relationship with China, but it turns out that China actually is somehow doing things that negatively impact you and you want to dial that back, you should give yourself an out to be able to do that. I think that's smart, again, on paper, but it's easier said than done in practice.
Sure.
Right? So this applies not just for Bangladesh, but really for any smaller or medium-sized country. This is, if you're a realist like me, you believe that we live in a dog-eat-dog world environment. It's an anarchical environment. The United Nations is there. International rules and norms of behavior are there, except when countries that are larger don't want to follow it, they don't have to. So now what? Well, that means everybody's got to find out who their real friends are and try to seek advantage through those relationships vis-a-vis others. That's the only way to survive in an anarchical government, or anarchical international system, and an increasingly, by the way, multipolar system.
So what I've understood is there are a lot of multifaceted layers to how to deal with this transactional multipolarity. And Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure. Dear viewers, if you have enjoyed our discussions, please stay connected to us through our social media platforms and our website. Allah Hafiz. See you in next episode.